네, 잠시 후 저희 랩업 세션.
The wrap-up session will soon begin. I'd like to ask the participants to please come inside and be seated.
Wrap-up session. So please come inside and take a seat. 네, 그리고 본 행사는 한영 동시 통역이 제공이 되고 있습니다. 혹시 통역이 필요하신 분들께서는 앞에 놓인 수신기 사용하시면 되고요. 한국어는 1번 그리고 영어는 2번으로 맞춰주시면 되겠습니다. We provide simultaneous interpretation for this forum. If you need interpretation, you can use the receivers in front of you on the table. Turn to channel 1 for Korean and 2 for English. Thank you. We will get started really soon. 네, 그럼 이제
And now we will start the wrap-up session. So for the first half of today, we discussed decarbonization this morning and digital transformation just now. And now we will invite ocean experts for an in-depth panel discussion. And before we start, let me introduce the moderator. We have Mr. Kim In-Hyun, professor at Korea University School of Law and also a captain. Professor Kim is already on stage. Please give a warm hand to Professor Kim. Thank you. And now you have the floor. Good afternoon. I am Kim In-Hyun, professor at Korea University School of Law. I teach maritime law. At this World Ocean Forum, I am a member of the planning committee. In track 1 and track 2, we discussed decarbonization and digital transformation. We had excellent presentations. I would first like to thank the two moderators of tracks 1 and 2. Professor Yong-su and Mr. An Kwang-hun. Thank you very much for moderating the tracks. As you know, 2D, the decarbonization and digitalization, have become the constant coefficient in this industry. They have taken root deep in the ecosystem of the industry, and as you can see in the room, we have many business participants, business sector participants, and I felt that 2D have really become a true part of the value chain of this industry. And with regard to these two sectors, there have been many presentations made and papers issued, but at the 16th World Ocean Forum, I think this is a very nice forum to look at the real case examples and real world solutions. I have already learned so much from the insightful presentations, and from President Shin Dong-sik, he gave us a very detailed explanation about the CCUS technology. And now we will have a panel session. First, we will start the discussions on decarbonization first. We have 10 panel discussants today. We will start with the decarbonization. Let me introduce the panels who will discuss decarbonization, and then we will move on to DX. First, we have Mr. Baek Jong-Hyuk, Senior Vice President for Nuclear R&D Strategy and Planning, Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute. Please give a warm hand to Mr. Baek. And next, we have Director Hyun-Ho from Hyundai Maritime Research Institute at the Hyundai Heavy Industries. Please say hello to the audience. We also have Ms. Madeline Rose, Climate Campaign Director of Pacific Environment. We also have Mr. Jin Gyoo-Ho, Vice President of Management at BPA, who also gave us a presentation this morning. And online, we also have Mr. Stavros Hatzigrigouris, Marine Consultant and former Managing Director of Maran Gas Maritime. So the panels have 5 minutes each to discuss the presentations and to also give your comments, as well as to share your views. Starting with Mr. Baek, please.
예, 반갑습니다.
Good afternoon. Well, this is not the field I'm quite. Well, it's great pleasure to join you, and not all of you share the same issues. In the nuclear field, I've been working in this field for 30 years, involved in developing nuclear reactors, and we made an export to the UAE, APR 1400, loaded and ready. That's what I developed when I first joined the Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute. So I'm mainly responsible for developing nuclear reactors. So I'm not the best expert in the field, but whether it be maritime or nuclear, I believe that we have similar challenges. When it comes to nuclear power, it's about creating energy. And how to utilize this energy is, of course, one of the things that we think about. And in terms of space and maritime, well, it's in line with the issues that you have. And stable supply of energy was a big topic. And now the topic is moving towards the utilization of this energy that is provided. So we have this keyword SMR in nuclear. I believe many of you heard this term in press coverage. So compared to previous reactors, well, it's about flexibility. Using nuclear power, how can we produce hydrogen, and also how we can increase processes and create power sources using nuclear. We have thought about it for a long time, and how this can be applied to maritime is one of the things we can think about. As the chair said, 2D, which is DT and diversification, were among the 3 Ds. So DT and diversification can be seen as another 2D. And that is related to nuclear. And I believe that that would be linked to the first step of maritime, whether it be electricity from nuclear power, whether it be thermal power, whether it be power generation. Well, for more than 2 decades, we've been working on how this can be utilized. And this is actually the application of this technology to maritime to be net zero. And all the collaboration work already started. We had a presentation of the head of CRISO. And in nuclear, we already started to work with major shipbuilders, 3 major shipbuilders in Korea, including SHI. And we are working on specifying our projects and how nuclear can be used as an energy source. And on the basis always is this concept of net zero. Reducing CO2 while transporting goods and cargoes to the 5 oceans are one of our top priorities. While doing so, well, I was on a business trip to Canada 2 weeks ago. It's an SMR regulation forum, SMR law forum, jointly hosted by Korea and Canada. And in North America, there are more than 70 startups that are responsible for nuclear power. And what they want to do is to reduce CO2 using nuclear to provide energy sources. It's not just about electricity generation. And in Canada, well, starting from next year, they're going to have carbon tax or carbon levy. and it's about 30 Canadian dollars. And that will increase by $15 every year to become $170. And what they want to achieve is to replace it with nuclear power. And also, there is this chemical factory that produces methanol. They want to have the nuclear power. And we are also working on how we can reach 5 oceans without producing CO2. The Ministry of Science and my organization, with the funding of national budget, are moving toward this direction. So before we reach 2030, we want to make sure that we produce some tangible results and make contribution to net zero. And we are working on this technology very hard. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much for the great message. That was very straightforward. So nuclear power can be used as fuels for vessels to achieve net zero. Thank you.
Next, we have Director Hyun-Ho from Hyundai Maritime Research Institute. Good afternoon. As introduced, I am Hyun-Ho. My area of expertise is shipbuilding engineering, and I have, since graduating university, I've been working at the shipyard. And this morning, during the decarbonization track in the shipbuilding sector, there were some relevant contents on shipbuilding or marine and transport. And this afternoon, we discussed digital transformation, which also was relevant to decarbonization. So Mr. Kim Jae-yeon also mentioned earlier, and I couldn't agree more. This is the first time in my career in the shipbuilding engineering that I see such a sea change in this industry. And shipbuilding engineering is a very important academic area for shipbuilding, but this discipline faces the largest crisis ever because although the ship stays the same, everything that goes into the ship, the equipment and machinery are changing very dramatically, and all the control systems accordingly. So in the shipbuilding industry, it is very difficult to respond to such challenges. But nevertheless, globally, decarbonization is the trend that we cannot reverse. And so we are making our own preparations. And as we heard from the SINTEF presentation from Mr. Rotset, there's the uncertainty that comes from regulations. And cooperation with other entities are very important. And the topic of this forum has the word cooperation in it. So what will happen with future regulations remain uncertain, and we need to explore different types of technologies and also consider what type of technologies that our clients want, because there are many different types. And for us, businesses that need to serve the needs of consumers, we need to consider every possibility. But how to efficiently allocate the time and human resources to do all this while differentiating ourselves from competitors. Well, all this cannot be done by a single company alone. So we need to work with other partners. And there can be different types of cooperations. There can be a government-led project. There can be business-to-business cooperation. And through such cooperations, individual businesses, also need to work on how to reinforce their own competitiveness. So to what extent do we work together, and to what extent do we differentiate ourselves from others? Well, that's a very, very important point and will become more important in the future. So on that front, we heard relevant and important presentations today, and with regard to decarbonization, the president from Mr. Hatzik Grigoris mentioned the LNG, that the LNG still remains the main fuel, and I agree. And when I discussed this with the ship owners, they all agree that LNG is a proven technology, proven fuel, and we already have a well-established supply chain for LNG. And we can add more technologies to the existing LNG system to respond to the regulatory changes up until 2030. But for net zero, what more do we need? That would be the main question going forward. I think that the technologies are still there. The existing technologies and the upcoming technologies are all really based on what is already here. So the CCUS technology was already around for decades, but the key is how to commercialize it and how to universalize it, and that is really about more of an economic problem. And if you look at new regulations coming out of the EU, I think the regulation is moving towards ensuring economic viability, imposing penalties and providing incentives. Is really to make sure that technologies that were not competitive can become more competitive and more economically viable. So in that sense, regulation will be needed. But I don't think that a single solution will dominate. Right now, the diesel-based diesel has been the main fuel for ships for decades. But going forward, I think we will see a more variety of fuels, whether it's LNG, H2, or methanol, or ethanol. The problem is whether we will have the right supply chain and who will provide the optimal logistics services to that supply chain will be the main game that we will be playing. And Korea has been and is a shipbuilding powerhouse, but not yet a shipping powerhouse. But I do think that Korea can have the right infrastructure to become a shipping powerhouse because Korea is a peninsula and Busan, the city of Busan, is one of the top 3 or top 2 global ports. And on the other hand, in terms of cooperation, we do need to work more because we pretty much work on our own. And in inducing and incentivizing cooperation, I think the government has a role to play by organizing different parties and providing the right framework and also enabling a nation-to-nation international cooperation with the right set of supports. And the basic technology and infrastructure also need to be funded by the government through government-led projects or research institutes. And if that can happen, I think that Korea has the right potential to become a shipping powerhouse. And of course, I understand that the Port of Busan is working to bolster its marine and shipbuilding industry. But for that to happen, we need a strong financial industry because otherwise we cannot compete globally. And so the shipping and shipping finance, ship financing industries, if these industries can receive the right support, I think that since Korea is already a leader in shipbuilding, we can lead the world. So I am deviating away from the topic of decarbonization, but decarbonization will take time and cost and cooperation will be enabled by the government support. Thank you. That was Director Lee Hyun-Ho. In relation to technology, LNG is the main fuel. Ammonia, methanol, and hydrogen are technologically available as ship fuels, but Korea is lagging behind somewhat in terms of shipping, so government needs to provide the right support so that we can become competitive in this path towards decarbonization.
Next, Dr. Jin Gyoo-Ho from BPA. Would you like to say a few words? Well, you already delivered the presentation. And listening to other presentations, if you have any additional comments, then you can talk about them. Good afternoon. I'm Jin Gyoo-Ho from BPA. This morning, I introduced you to the BPA projects, and I thought that this might not be in line with the topic, decarbonization. But at BPA, in the process of decarbonization, while reducing CO2, well, what we can use is electricity and LNG. And with that in mind, we have strategies. And when it comes to vessels and equipment for loading and unloading trucks, I covered these points in terms of decarbonization. And in order to build CO2-free ports, well, LNG generates CO2, but much less compared to diesel or fossil fuels. Electricity also uses fossil fuels, so we can't really say that it is CO2-free. The Korean government has this project for 2050 for decarbonization vision, and we have this hydrogen port included in the vision. So in the morning session, we looked at shipbuilding and marine transport, and what we have to think about is what fuels we're going to use, and depending on our choice in building our bunkering base, depending on the fuel type, if LNG is the big trend, then we have to build a bunkering base to meet that requirement. And if it's ammonia, then we also have to build the base to accommodate ammonia. So it really depends on how we decide on the types of the fuels. And in port of Busan, in order to be net zero by 2050, producing electricity internally and to be energy independent, I believe that we have to secure that capability in order to achieve true net zero and to be competitive in the long term. So by 2050, reduction of 70%, and for all diesel cars will be changed to LNG, and also they will change to DPF. And in order for that to happen, we need alternative fuels. Hydrogen charging stations are one of the things that we're considering. And with the development of alternative fuels, we believe that we can utilize these fuels to be net zero port. Starting from this May, we're working with experts to be net zero in the field of shipping, in the field net zero, in order to be net zero ports by 2050. And we're working closely with major ports around the world so that the port of Busan can play a leading role in these efforts. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Jin. Listening to your presentation in the morning, what was impressive was, well, regarding the yard tractors and unloading and loading devices, well, how these can be switched to be more eco-friendly. And that's in line with the government policies towards hydrogen ports. So once we decide on the types of the fuels for the vessels, then we can come up with ways to transport fuels. So that was very impressive, and it is a promising insight.
전문가들에게
And now I would like to ask our two international speakers to take the floors. We have Ms. Madeline Rose from the Pacific Environment. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you all again. Thank you so much to the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries, to the Busan Metropolitan City, to Busan Port Authority, to Kami, to everyone in the planning committees, again, for welcoming Pacific Environment this year for our first World Oceans Forum. We've been so impressed and so inspired by the leadership, the commitment to zero carbon, zero emission shipping and ports, and just the innovation and leadership that we've heard in the last 48 hours from CRISO, from HMM, from the Busan Port Authority. I really think you have more electric cranes on your port than anywhere in the world that I've seen so far, so it really has been tremendous. Because I have a global mandate, so I run a 15-person climate team that works on shipping and ports around the world. We cover, California policy, United States policy, International Maritime Organization policy, G20 policy. We kind of cover it all. So I thought perhaps the most useful thing I could do is provide some thoughts and comments on the trends that we're seeing outside of Korea, just to reflect on what we've heard today. So the first kind of trend that I didn't hear a lot about, but I think is really exciting, is the trend towards zero emission ferries and zero emission harbor vessels and zero emission short sea shipping. So to start the technology transition, we don't have to only talk about the Trans-Pacific or the Transatlantic, but really starting with the vessels that we can electrify and focus on those. So in Norway, they're planning to have a zero emission zone in the Norway fjords, their marine protected area, only zero emission ferries by 2026. It's just around the corner. In California, we have a new mandate for zero emission short run ferries in 2025. And just today I learned that the Busan Port Authority has many passenger ferries that are electrified that will be on the water as early as next year. So really committing to electrifying all of the small vessels that we can is an exciting trend that we can focus on, and somewhere where Busan, I think, can lead and show the world. The second trend is a focus on zero in-port pollution. So many colleagues this morning talked about Fuel EU Maritime, but they were focused on the fuel uptake mandate and the sort of long-range greenhouse gas targets for big shipping. But the Fuel EU Maritime bill also has an in-port pollution standard that is modeled off of California's port pollution standard, which China also adopted. So that means it's a requirement that all ships that will call European ports must plug into shore power by 2030 or must otherwise be zero emission. So that's really going to catalyze the shore power market, or alternative marine power market, basically more electricity in the ports, but cleaner air and healthy communities for port residents. So it's a really important policy where I think, from what I understand, I don't think Korea currently has a zero emission port pollution commitment, which I think could be a really great place for additional leadership. Third, on the greenhouse gas targets for the big ships, I often say the big kahuna, the big ones. A lot of colleagues this morning mentioned the existing IMO targets, but I just think we should all be clear and honest with ourselves that those targets are soon to be irrelevant. We expect that the IMO is going to pass an amended strategy next summer, June 2023, under Secretary General Ki Tak-lim's leadership. Hopefully that will be requiring 100% zero emissions, 100% zero carbon. We hope 100% zero carbon equivalents, but we'll see, by as soon as June 2023. So the initial ambition of the policy mentioned this morning is really just the floor. All of that is to say we are going to have to go faster. For the global shipping industry to do its fair share for reaching the global carbon budget, the entire industry actually should be much closer to zero carbon by 2040, not 2050. Of course, 2050 is a great start. I used to work in government. I understand you have to start somewhere. So starting with 2050 makes sense, but we do need to be honest with ourselves that even zero by 2050 would not be aligned with a livable world of, really trying to mitigate 1.5 degree or 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And then, on that front, just want to, comment that we do have we run a campaign called Ship It Zero. There's cute little personified stickers out in the lobby, smiley ships, they're very cute. But that is a campaign focused on accelerating the zero emission vessel market. So through that campaign, we've worked with Amazon, IKEA, Target, some of the world's largest companies who have committed to zero carbon ocean shipping by 2040. And they really are looking to partner with shipping companies like HMM that can offer them the best, fastest zero carbon commercially available option. And they're really willing to, use their market power, stick their necks out to help create this market demand and realize the zero emission vessel market. So those are a few reflections. We have a new campaign, which is one of the reasons we're here, which is called Ports for People. There's, again, some materials out there, and happy to talk about that more, and happy to talk about LNG more, and why we disagree that it's the fuel for the future, since it is a fossil-based fuel. But I will save that for later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Madeline Rose. You mentioned the decarbonization regulations on large vessels is important, but it's nice to work with the small vessels such as ferries. And also import regulation will be also important. You shared some case examples, and at the end you said that LNG may not be the answer. Thank you.
Next online, we have Mr. Stavros Hatchgrigoris from Greece. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. My topic was LNG technology. I believe LNG technology has leaped forward quite a lot over the past 20 years. It's the only sector in shipping for which the technology has changed a lot. This was part of my presentation. I understand that LNG is a transit fuel, but there are other projects about green methane, green LNG, green methanol that may help to move towards the zero carbon, zero emissions target. There is a project going on now. It is involving one of the Middle East countries. They will import LNG, they will split the LNG in hydrogen and CO2. They will capture CO2. This is going to be green CO2. The liquid CO2 will be transported to Europe and mixed again with hydrogen to produce green methane. This is a technology that, and it's not only about methane, this is a technology that we should be careful about, focus on it. If you read the International Energy Agency report, you will see that they say that even by 2050, there will be plenty of fossil fuels around. And the solution to move towards decarbonization is to capture the CO2, make it liquid or make it lime. There are about 20 companies now working towards carbon capture, and then sequester the CO2 or use it to produce green fuels, as I said before, green methanol, green LNG. I believe the LNG industry is very, very important for Korea. Korea is the leading country for LNG ships construction. The technology is also changing there. Shipyards are booked until the end of 2026, and some ships will be delivered in 2027. Korea has to be careful not to lose this industry toward China. Recently, there have been at least 4 Chinese yards that have never been involved in the LNG industry before, and they have received orders. To conclude, if the LNG will be very important for reducing carbon emissions until, let's say, 2035 maybe, and then we have to look for a different technology, and in this respect, I believe carbon capture, liquefying the CO2, and sequestering will be very, very important. As per the IEA report, 40% of the CO2 produced by fossil fuels in 2050 will be captured and sequestered or used, as I said, to produce green fuels. Again, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry that I could not come to Busan this time, and all the best to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the great message and for the great conclusion. Using LNG, well, we can use this technology, use this fuel for quite a long time. And regarding the CO2 that is generated, well, we can utilize CCUS technology. It can be liquefied and it can be utilized, captured. And in Korea, well, how Korea is leading the shipbuilding in terms of LNG. So let me once again thank you for your remarks and insights. Thank you very much.
예, 일단 우리 토론.
So we are halfway into this panel. Those of you participating online or those of you on site, if you have any questions about decarbonization, please submit your questions so that I can deliver those questions to our panelists at the end of today's track. And moving on to digital transformation. We have had very specific case examples shared with us during this track. In particular, the effects of digital twins. I think we heard from the BPA, 5 case examples were shared, and it was a very good learning session for me, and I felt the urgent need for this. And from AWS, you shared good ideas about the cloud technology, and I was able to feel that digitalization greatly helps our daily lives. And based on the presentations given today, I would like to invite the panels for their comments. Let me introduce the panelists first. We have Mr. Nam Yong-su, CEO of ValuelinkU. Please say hello to the audience. A member of our planning committee, Mr. Oh Soo-han, Professor of Department of International Logistics at Chung-Ang University. We also have from the government, the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries, we have Director Keun-hyung for Smart Shipping and Logistics Team. And our presenter, Mr. Ornolf Jan Roseth, Senior Researcher Scientist of SINTEF Norway. Mr. Nam, would you like to begin? Hello, I am Nam Yong-su from ValuelinkU. With regard to digital transformation, we were able to hear technologies and real case examples. Smart ports, smart ships, and cloud services, digital strategies were the 4 main parts of what we heard today. Digital transformation not only in shipping and shipbuilding, but in many other industrial sectors. There have been many different presentations made, and I think that you have become somewhat familiar with the topic. Rather than summarizing the presentations, I would like to share with you my personal comments based on the presentations. those of us preparing for digital transformation, do we go from outside in or inside out? That's the key question. Many digital technologies are not recent. They have been in place for 20, 30 years, and they continue to evolve. So do we use this technology to cut costs and raise efficiency? That would be one part. And another part would be to develop new businesses and services to transform the business with digital technologies. So that is another big part. So I think today's presentation really focused on the inside-out strategy, which I think would have been better if we heard from the outside-in technology as well. So what does it mean to do an outside-in tech strategy? Well, this may be overlapping with the earlier presentation, and we also heard from Ornov from the outside-in approach. So when you think of eco-friendly ships, you might think that it'll be very quick for us to reach net zero, but that's not the case. There are existing ships in operation as well, and there are two main drivers. One, service providers, the shipping companies, and secondly, the consumer group of shippers. But do you know whether shippers are using eco-friendly ships or not? It's the same for the carriers and for the air cargo. Clients do not know whether the plane that they're riding are SAF attached or not. The shippers don't know either whether the ship that they are booking is eco-friendly or not, and same goes for air transport. If the shipper knew, then they would try to prioritize the use of eco-friendly ships. So this is where the seller and buyer needs to work together. And if we were to enable this with digital technologies, well, of course, Green Cargo Working Group is providing some of those relevant technologies, but what they do is they just provide the average information rather than being specific as to which ships are eco-friendly. But of course, starting next year with CII coming into play, then that will be a different story. But for all the inland shipping and the ocean-going shipping, if I were to use 20,000 TEU grade vessels, how much carbon have I used and have I emitted? Well, that is managed under Scope 3, but under the Green Cargo Working Group, you are given a sum of each ship, so you do not have a specific data. So for each ship, we need to have the specific cargo emissions, truck cargo emissions, warehouse emissions, and port emissions, and put that all together for booking services. This was not available before, but digital technology platform and data will make this possible. Eco-friendly is therefore impacted by digital transformation, and digital technologies have a role to play in eco-friendly areas. And single window is a very important part you heard today earlier. You think about inside-out strategy of using these technologies, but it's a very high-risk type of business. Ports have ship data and developing digital twins. Well, that can be very high risk. Autonomous ships, when you do not have the data on other types of ships and ports, just developing autonomous ships without any of those relevant data at your hand, it will be quite high risk. So in the end, you eventually see a single central point of concentration. And in that sense, single window is a very important platform. It is an integrated data platform, and through standardization, when there's data transaction, you can also analyze that data. And all these relevant technologies are at the basis to support autonomous ports and ships going forward. But this is not possible because data is not available. Nobody wants to share their data. So what can be done now? Our company's example is that we create a automated data first, and we purchase the relevant data and share the data and in turn get the data from others and build new data based on that and continue the exchange. So after playing the virtuous role, we can then expect more technological development. So going forward, digital strategies, well, we hear a lot about the need for building a platform. And you might think of a commercial trading type of platform, but going forward, in particular in the ocean sector, platform will be more of an SG and management and data platform rather than commercial. And plus, there will be digital technologies attached for big data analysis, AI, quantum technologies for automation. So next year, maybe we can look into these case examples to share insight from that perspective. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nam. I'm not sure if I understood your comment because that was quite technical. He is a digital expert. So inside out, rather than inside out, based on the individual perspective, outside in is more of the strategy that we need. So you need to share your data and engage in data exchanges for public good.
Next, Professor Woo Soo-han, please. Good afternoon. I'm from Chung-Ang University. Throughout the day, we talked about shipbuilding and marine transport. So having this integrated theme is indeed meaningful, and this is our first, actually. I learned so much from today's sessions, and also especially when it comes to autonomous technologies and how these are being developed. Well, it was really interesting to see this technological development. So we looked at many presentations and new technologies. But on the other hand, I thought that there is kind of a gap. And as I teach students, I would like to talk about talents regarding DT. So in a narrow sense, DT can be interpreted as business transformation, creating new businesses using a hardware. But today, DT we talk about is about exchanging objects between objects and single window, collecting data, creating data, and sharing this data, having such infrastructure. So that was more of a focus today. And if you think about the business that can be created out of this, well, you can think of shipping companies. And when it comes to DT, what are these shipping companies doing? Well, not much at the moment. Well, in the case of spot freight for containers, well, selling spot freight is pretty much where we stand at, and not really going beyond that. Still, top 10 container shipping companies, this is what top 10 companies are doing, and that is actually less than 5% of the total revenue around the globe. And if you think about the relationship between shippers and VOCCs and carriers, what that means is that we are seeing an expanded channel for the shippers and for the shippers to meet the carriers. So from this perspective, the shipping companies in terms of DT can identify the characteristics of different shippers and what searches are done by these different shippers, at what prices, and based on what behaviors. And on the basis of this analysis, well, we can create services and provide services to meet their needs. And this is related to CRM. Market conditions can be reflected, and additional services can be provided based on this information. And using these platforms, we can expand the existing businesses. So that's how we can approach it. To do that, the organizational structures of shipping companies and their personnel, well, they have personnel for shipping, for sales. Well, can these personnel cover all these activities with these new service platforms? And when shippers make purchases and there is an upsell opportunity, and we might want to give some recommendations to them so that this can lead to an upselling. And this is what we can utilize the case of Amazon, where it recommends a personalized service. For that, we need different knowledge of domain, shipping, data logistics. And do we have talents that have all this knowledge? So that's one of the issues that many shipping companies are faced with. One of the Asian shipping companies, it's a middle-sized company. It wants to pursue DT, and the company was very angry at me because I'm teaching logistics and I cannot nurture any talents, but still I'm telling them to employ students from this field, and this company is only employing students from engineering majors. The talents that we need are the ones that have data analytics knowledge. And starting from the undergraduate courses, logistics, shipping, data analytics, DT, all these elements have to be reflected in the courses so that we can develop right talents. And for the last 5 years, this is what I was working on as well. And on the government side, when it comes to shipping and shipbuilding, when it provides support for these sectors, well, it does provide support for R&D and other fields. But when it comes to nurturing talents, well, this is something that we are not really keen on at the moment. So we are talking about DT from the business perspective, and I wanted to highlight the importance of talents. And also, related to decarbonization, well, we looked at autonomous vessels, alternative fuels, and so on. And we had lots of discussions based on IMO regulations. But from shipping companies' point of view, once we comply with all these regulations, then does it mean we meet all the requirements by our shippers for CO2 reduction? Renewable energy 100% is something that we are pursuing, but that is excluded in the ESG strategy. So if we stick to, or if we are only paying attention to IMO regulations, then is it sufficient enough to meet the requirements of shippers? I don't think we had active discussions on this point. Yes, we do look at IMO regulations, but we have to look at the supply chain as a whole, and we have to have a sense check as to where we stand. Thank you. Yes, Professor Wu, thank you for the insight. He teaches business management, so I believe that he through a fresh perspective. I also teach maritime law, so I agree with many parts of what he said. And when it comes to the platforms that we are developing, using these platforms, where shipping companies and shippers can meet. Currently, MVOCCs and forwarders are in between. So currently, we have these parties in between, and going forward, the presence of forwarders will be removed, and the shipping companies would directly talk to shippers. So that will be a major change in the future, which he brought up also nicely. And also, we have to have knowledge of domains, logistics, and all the relevant fields. And we have to nurture talents with that in mind.
Keun-hyung.
Next, from the MOF, I'd like to invite Director Hong Keun-hyung to take the floor. Good afternoon. I am the Director for Smart Shipping and Logistics team of the MOF. My name is Hong Keun-hyung. I'm listening to the presentation from experts. I was able to learn so much. And from the government's perspective, being a part of a forum such as this is to understand the trend and to reflect what is heard and requested here to into the policies. I would like to share with you the MOF policies and what kind of efforts are being made. The MOF in 2019 set up the strategy to build a shipping and logistics platform. And in 2021, Smart Logistics Development Policy. And last year, Shipping Marine Innovative Regulatory Roadmap has been set up. So in the mid to long term, we do have a roadmap in place. Port automation, smart port infrastructure, smart ports, connecting the logistics inland and offshore. Under these missions, we have 11 projects. 400 billion won of budget is in place. And at the Smart Shipping and Logistics team, we look at the autonomous ship research and development. I think this was already presented by Dr. Kim Jin. And not only technological development, but preparing international standards and setting up the domestic legislation accordingly is where we also work. For autonomous ships, this is a new type of system. So we do need to review the relevant legislation, and when the ships are fully validated, they need to be commercialized, and all this process will need legislative support. So we will enact new law in terms of allowing for a special treatment of autonomous ships in terms of validation and commercialization. And for autonomous ships, as you heard from the other presenters, there is the international standard in place, and we need to contribute and lead the way in developing standards by taking full participation at IMO meetings, and we are doing just that. And with regard to smart ports, we have a automation testbed in Gwangyang Port. And for the first time, we want to automate the full port. And we will be using domestically developed equipment and many different types of new technologies. The fully proven and demonstrated technologies will be used to Junhae Busan Port to become the world's smartest port. And this remains to be seen. So at the World Ocean Forum, I hope in the future we will have an opportunity to make a relevant presentation. And as the professor has rightly pointed out, once smart digital transformation takes place, there will be a large pool of talents in need. We need to train them well and for them to find the right jobs and to transition their careers. So a practice-based education and training program and career change program will also be offered to develop a pool of talents and also to address the existing problems. Along with decarbonization, digital transformation are very important issues. Well, smart digital transformation is already fully reflected in the national policies and projects, and we will continue our efforts on that front. And it is a great opportunity to be here to listen to the trend and to reflect your needs into our policies. Thank you. Thank you, Director Hong. You shared with us the government efforts on digital transformation and decarbonization policies. You mentioned the automated port testbed in Gwangyang Port. And as Professor Woo has mentioned, you also gave your positive comment on developing a pool of talents.
그 오늘 부연
Next, Senior Scientist In-Hyeon Rose, please.
예, 부탁드리겠습니다.
Sorry, get rid of that. It has been an interesting day. I think the first session really showed us the problems we are facing in decarbonizing shipping. It will be a big challenge. But as yesterday's prize winner said, challenges also mean opportunities and innovations. And after innovation, there may also be disruption. I'll come back to that. I think, again, going back to the problems we have with decarbonization, we have talked about fuels, hull structures, and so on and so forth, but my special interest is, of course, making the whole supply chain, the logistics chain, more efficient. There's a lot of things to do there, and I expect energy prices for fuel to go up significantly. And that really means that we also have to save energy if you really want to have shipping having the role it has today. So I think efficiency is in any way necessary. And that means basically automation of the supply chains, logistics chains, efficiency, improvements in ships, and so on and so forth. And then we are back to digitalization and automation. Part of that is also autonomous ships that was discussed also today. And in all these areas, and I'll come back to what I said in my presentation, shipping is a very small sector. It's not a lot of people working with this. And we cannot afford to compete with non-competitive, pre-competitive, necessary knowledge. Kim Jin mentioned all this problem with testing, safety standards for autonomous ships. This is not something that we should work on independently. We should cooperate. Interface standards, digital standards, and all this stuff is really something we need to do together. And this is pre-competitive. It's not a big competitive advantage to develop a standard. Using the standard, on the other hand, is the important thing. Then you can get these innovations, new products, better products, and improve your competition. And I'm from Norway, and we are willing to take up the competition with Korea. We have a very good relationship. We cooperate somewhere, and we cooperate and compete other places. But we really need to still cooperate on developing the necessary baseline for producing the new products. And the last point, which we haven't discussed at all, and I'll come back to what I mentioned about disruption. If you look at the two commercial or semi-commercial projects we have on autonomous ships in Norway today, Yara and Asko, they represent totally new logistics chains, operated by the cargo owners, not by ship owners. It's a totally new business model. Likewise, we have heard some examples of how digitalization may change business models, which again may mean disruption. We may have to think about totally new logistics transport systems. we should be aware that a lot of ship owners today, they are not concerned about transporting goods. They are concerned about selling and buying ships, which is not a really good business model for tackling these sustainable development goals and the challenges with decarbonization. So there is a real chance, I think, that we may get some more or less disruptive changes in business model in this area. So that was my observations, and thank you for a very good conference, very comprehensive, and a lot of different themes which fits very good together. Thank you.
Mr. Oon of Hyun Rodsef. So based on his presentation, he shared with us with his insight and also the disruption that we haven't thought about and digitalization, how this can be, how this can change the relationship with shippers.
토론자
And that was it for the panel discussion on the second topic of digital transformation. And now we will take questions either from the floor or from online participants. We have a hand up, 2 hands up on the floor. Please bring a microphone. And could you please introduce yourselves and state your affiliation? Hello, I am Professor Kim Ki-seung from Busan University of Foreign Studies. 2 things. When we bring in LNG carriers and it was mentioned that we need to capture the carbon that comes out of LNG carriers, but this seems to be very costly. And where do we put the carbon? The storage of carbon is very challenging. So for zero carbon, we need to make so much sacrifice. I am very worried. And secondly, in terms of digital transformation, this is a good movement, but for shippers all the way from the warehouse to the means of transport, if all the carbon emitted in the process is to be calculated, then countries like Korea, where would see so much rise in logistics costs, that in terms of shipping and logistics may lose competitiveness. And the logistics cost will go up too much to be a burden on the shippers. So I think that for a most convenient and cleanest environment, well, net zero by 2050, for example, do we really need to think that carbon is the biggest enemy of the mankind? I think that we need to be more flexible than that, because in Korea, already there are so many small-scale vessels, but there's no support given to those vessels. If we only make the investment in mechanisms, are we going to really realize green piers? We really need to think about these points.
예, 마지막에 영세
So at the end, did you say DWT, small DWT? Yes, I meant that there are many small vessels, such as small fishing vessels in Korea. Almost all of them use sulfur-emitting fuels, which are a large source of pollution. and I can sense that when I go walking along the shore. So for those small vessels, the government should provide more subsidies. When they provide subsidies for eco-friendly ships, why don't they subsidize these small vessels for their conversion to cleaner fuels? Carbon capture and sequestration, all that seems very distant and far away. We should be more realistic in our approach. Yes, I understand your point. So in the end, you said that for old-aged vessels, they emit more carbon and they should be converted over to cleaner fuel for us to reduce carbon. Investing in LNG, carbon capture, sequestration, desalination, we should invest in more realistic type of policies. So we will gather more questions and ask our panels to answer the questions later. We have another question.
예, 아까 김기순 교수님 질문은 우리 진규
Professor Kim's question is, maybe this can be addressed by Mr. Chin. I'm An Kwang-hoon from Hyundai Heavy Industries.
여기 3트랙 연사 패널들 분께서
The panelists from the wrap-up session shared with us their insights and remarks. And it seems like I have to extend my deepest apologies because I couldn't persuade one of the participants who just raised the question, who has doubts about the technologies that we talked about throughout the day. So my deepest apologies. And what I want to say is, well, all the panelists represent their fields. So it seems like we have three major issues to sum up. First, about CO2 reduction. We have to understand the needs accurately in building our ships. We have to understand the needs first before we talk about decarbonization. And by having digital platforms, does it mean that all the conditions are met? Does it solve all the problems? For many years, I attended conferences and meetings, and I have questions from our customers. Well, if we achieve DET, then many of the jobs will be lost. That's what they think, but I beg to differ. Well, we see DET and digitalization. And in order to support DET, we will need more high-skilled people. In Busan, we have this remote support center. And in this remote support center, we have more people than those who work at Hyundai Heavy Industries. And at schools, nurturing talents is a big issue. And many companies and businesses are considering this as well. Considering the reality of Korea compared to Europe or the US, while situations might be slightly different in these regions, but in Korea, at schools, in terms of decarbonization and DET, they have to be preemptive in developing their curricula. But actually, businesses lead the efforts and schools are following the footsteps. And next, about sharing information and data. Well, data sharing platform has become a big issue, and we had lots of discussions around this in Europe as well. Currently, data is not being shared because these companies see this data, their competitive edge. So how do we persuade these companies to share data and information? That will be a big challenge. And when it comes to data sharing, well, is it from the perspective of shippers or other parties. So it really depends on different stakeholders. And currently, we fail to persuade shippers. But when it comes to decarbonization and DET, well, we have to revisit this approach. Why do we pursue these two Ds? Regarding decarbonization, we're talking about this with our panelists and businessmen. And when we had such a discussion 2 years ago, even though Europe was very keen on developing measures and developing responses, Korea was very reluctant to handle these issues. So the two big trends in the field of shipbuilding, maritime, transport, we are seeing these new technologies emerging. So what I'd like to suggest is at schools and public agencies and research institutes, well, my responsibility, my expertise is shipbuilding and maritime business. But anyway, we have to see the linkage between these different elements, different fields, in order to tackle related issues, autonomous navigation, talents, fuels, and so on. So the reason why we're talking about autonomous navigation is because it's closely related to alternative fuels. And once we resolve the issue of alternative fuels, then there will be huge growth for autonomous navigation. And that will change the nature of the relationship between logistics and the shippers. So we have to think about the linkage. And when we have a next forum, I actually took a note of everything you said. And these can be incorporated into developing the next forum. And also, for presenters and panelists, I believe we can share our concerns and thoughts and make these discussions public. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. An. While covering all three sessions throughout the day, you made a general comment. And based on the industry you're in, we have different levels of understanding. So these can be factored in the next forum to have an open discussion. So thank you for the great insight.
김기순 교수.
And why don't we go to the question from Professor Kim? Perhaps Mr. Jin Gyoo-Ho, you can take that question. Yes, I am Jin Gyoo-Ho from the BPA. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer the question, but let me try. LNG carrier and all the efforts made on that front for carbon neutrality seems too much, you said, and that if shippers are to calculate all the carbon emitted throughout the logistics process, that'll be too costly, and in the end weaken our competitiveness. And where vehicles receive so much, automobiles receive so much government subsidies, why not for smaller vessels? Well, yes, you are right. But I read a few days ago that there are 196 countries around the world, and there are 128 countries that participate in carbon neutrality because climate change is a very serious issue worldwide. and the awareness is there. Then what kind of impact will climate change have? Well, the temperature will go up, which will lead to higher sea levels. And we will have an upswelling in the ocean. 20 to 25% of fisheries production will go down. And in the polar area, sea ice will melt. And in the case of the North Pole, 15%. And Antarctica, 20% of the sea ice will melt. And this will lead to corrosion of the coastal areas and erosion and inundation. So climate change will push up social costs globally significantly. That is the general consensus. And so countries around the world need to do what they can by establishing the policies at the national level. And for the digital transformation and the shipper cost, well, if in the end logistics cost is able to go down for Korean logistics companies to become globally competitive, that would be very nice. But too much cost being transferred over to the shipper will not be very ideal. But there's also the other side of digital transformation that will bring a lot of cost reduction. In this morning, we heard from the BPA, the digital twin platform was presented. The digital twin platform will reduce the cost by 15%. So digital transformation also brings a cost reduction, which may offset the higher costs in some other areas. And for very small vessels, I think the MOF is the better place to ask the question. But for old and small aged vessels, engine development, fishing vessel, aged fishing vessel, shipbuilding projects are being done by the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries as part of the carbon neutrality roadmap. Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Kim, I hope that was a sufficient answer to your question. Realistically speaking, in relation to environmental regulation, if we are to violate those regulations, vessels will not be able to leave ports. So ship owners must be very aware of regulations, and that's why shipyards are preparing for decarbonization. And with that, I would like to conclude the Q&A session. I would like to give my closing remarks, if I may. Oh, just one last question.
마무리하실 전에 죄송합니다.
My apologies. You were just going to wrap up the session, but I had a quick question. I'm with Climate Solution. I'm with one of the climate groups in Seoul. I have two questions. First, among 190 countries, 128 are pursuing net zero. Then regarding that, the use of coal, fossil fuels, will be reduced in our journey to net zero, so it's bound to get reduced. And shipbuilding is included in our session. And in shipbuilding, we build lots of LNG vessels. 80% of them are built by Korean shipbuilders. So with this pursuit of net zero, well, what would be the alternative, or what would be the way forward for the Korean shipbuilders? Maybe HHI can provide an answer. And regarding renewable energy 100%, well, there can be needs for low carbon vessels by shippers. And I was wondering if the needs are really there in Korea. So I don't know who can address this question, but I was wondering, well, we have the actual needs for these low carbon vessels. Then can you quickly address the questions? Well, that was a question for HHI. So going forward, well, my understanding is that other than LNG, what would be the future vessels? Is that correct? Well, we already discussed this. Same thing applies for vessels, airplanes, and cars. If there are markets, then businesses will follow the needs. Currently, we need LNG, and that's why we have this big business for LNG. And in the future, what we can expect is CO2 capture and handling this. We are already seeing projects of handling CO2 carriers, and CO2 capture equipment. And in order to convert CO2 into energy, well, clean methanol, clean energy, hydrogen. In order to generate electricity, we can use PV and wind power. And also, we have this ocean where we can build plants. So we have many different options, and we have underwater pipelines that are being researched. So I believe that we have a huge industry. So we are not really concerned about having no business at all. Okay. Regarding the question, well, do we have the needs for low carbon vessels from the shipper's perspective? Yes, we do. Well, for shipping companies, Scope 3 is related to managing shippers. And in the bidding materials of global companies, they have to report whether they have these alternatives. And this information is included in the bidding document. And this is evaluated in the bidding process. The Clean Cargo Working Group started its activities 20 years ago. And the data that we get is average data. So for low carbon vessels or air, which need huge investments, we don't really differentiate these two, distinguish these two. So regarding the application of Scope 3, when we actually apply Scope 3, I think we can consider a buy vessel. And if I may, I would like to elaborate on the technologies. Well, in calculating the needs, well, it doesn't really mean additional costs, and it's about marginal cost. So you might think that there's a huge investment pending, but it's more about removing this marginal cost utilizing these technologies. Yes, thank you very much. So I believe this is time to wrap up. We are 15 minutes behind our schedule. From early this morning till now, we looked at decarbonization, digital transformation, and I'd like to thank you for your active participation. Well, Mr. In-Hyeon from AWS, he stressed how we have to collaborate with operating personnel. The industry and IT technologies have to work together. As I teach law and Professor Wu teaches business management, we understand that having the technology doesn't always translate into commercialization or resolving issues. The society is made up of people, and this is related to the society. So in the 17th World Ocean Forum, when we talk about DT and decarbonization, I believe we can talk about business management, law, and maritime operations to find more practical solutions. So to sum up, when it comes to technologies, I believe we already have the leading technologies in Korea, and many of you would agree. Thank you once again for great discussions, and I'd like to thank all the 8 panelists. And 7 days after today's conference, well, the sessions will be shared on the website of the World Ocean Forum, so you can check this information. With this, we'd like to close this session, and tomorrow we're going to talk about ocean and maritime policies, maritime design, and epilogue. I look forward to your cooperation and support, and I will meet you tomorrow again online and